Welcome to South Asian Environment Dialogue. And with COP27 hardly a couple of weeks away, we are all gearing up for the next COP, the COP27 at Egypt. Many are talking about the possibility of great things in a developing country COP. But today, a report has come up, the NDC synthesis report, which is saying basically that we have done some good things over the last 1 year, but not good enough. The world is still on course for a 2.5-degree rise by the century end, and that's not a good news at all. And tomorrow and day after, several other reports are supposed to come up, and I expect those reports will be in a similar line. So in that context, what is going to happen in COP27? Will climate fight back? So we are having this series in Climate TV channel and the Plurals, where we call it COP27, Will Climate Fight Back? And in this series today, I'm with me, my very good friend, Harjeet Singh. Harjeet is the head Global Political Strategy, Climate Action Network International, also a senior advisor of Climate Action Network International, have many other feathers. And Harjeet, most importantly, has been tracking this climate negotiation, especially the issues like migration, loss and damage, adaptation, and all for a number of years, and is a very important voice from the civil society in the global negotiation. Welcome, Harjeet, to the show.
Thank you very much, Jayanta, and always a pleasure to speak to you.
Absolute pleasure and privilege to have you. Now, let us go directly to this COP27, hardly a couple of weeks away. What do you think? Let us start with a very open-ended question. To be very fair, Glasgow didn't aim the way I think you all have expected to. You all expected to be much stronger output, but it didn't happen. And since Glasgow, the COVID has gone away a bit, but the Ukraine war has come up. So there's a lot of kind of pull and pushes. So how do you expect this COP27 to go?
You're absolutely right, Jayanta. We are facing one crisis after the other. And at this moment, with inflation rising around the world, and particularly in the developed world, and the food and energy crisis also faced by vulnerable people, and people who were not so vulnerable are now much more facing this crisis as well. And with this kind of a situation, we go to the COP, where we know that previous commitments have not been met. And that's why the Egyptian presidency has been focusing much more on implementation, because that's what matters. We can keep going to these climate conferences and keep making pledges, but if we are not implementing our own commitments, then we will not be able to solve the crisis. And this is exactly what has been demonstrated by the recent synthesis report from UNFCCC, which shows that we are not really bending the curve of reducing carbon emissions, which are absolutely fundamental to avert the crisis, and not at all in line with what science tells us to stay below 1.5 degree. So a marginal development is not going to help us. What we need is a leap in reducing emissions, but also preparing for the world to deal with impacts and supporting people who are already suffering from the crisis, which is about addressing loss and damage.
Right. We'll come to loss and damage, Harjeet, but before that, as you mentioned about the one crisis affecting after another. Now, with this reality at our back, and with this all this what's happening around us, we know realistically, how we expect this COP27 to contribute to the overall climate issues and agendas across the world. Your realistic expectation from COP27.
My realistic expectation is, which is also the most important thing, the first one, which is also a priority of Climate Action Network, is to have an agreement to establish loss and damage finance facility. And the reason I'm saying that, not because we as civil society are putting forth as a key demand, because people are suffering right now,
Right.
and UNFCCC system has been failing in terms of regaining people's trust in the system. We need to send a message of hope that we are seeing the issues around us. We want to help vulnerable people, and then also invest in adaptation. This is another issue which is very close to Africa. on how we are going to put more resources on the issue
Right.
of adaptation. If we are less prepared, we are going to see more loss and damage. And at the same time, reminding rich countries of their commitment to reduce emissions. Now,
Great.
this particular COP is important to tell them that you have not been meeting your commitments. And that message needs to go loud and clear, especially the way Europe has been now making new investments in Africa on oil and gas.
Right. And exactly on that front, this loss and damage, you said that you expect it to be the most important thing to come up. Now, we have been tracking this loss and damage, and it has been almost successfully put to back burner by the developed countries. Till it came back, we were roaring in the last Glasgow. Till the last day, it was quite a formidable share, but then it was pushed back. So, attempted global facility was turned into a global dialogue. Now, with that kind of thing, do you expect that facility with finance will come up, will maybe agreed upon by the developed countries?
Jayanta, it's very much possible because
Okay.
we have seen progress. For the first time, any incoming presidency organized a meeting in its capital city exclusively on loss and damage. On 10th and 11th of September, heads of delegations from around the world came to Cairo to discuss the issue of loss and damage. I think this is unprecedented. And now the statements from the European Union and the US agreeing to put it on the agenda, it's happening for the first time. So loss and damage finance is on the agenda. A few details are yet to be worked out, but this has been a civil society demand, and our pressure has worked. And the leadership of some of the developing countries, in particular, like small island states supported by least developed countries and other groups, has really helped. And it is a real issue. And now developed countries cannot continue to make that excuse that they did not come prepared. We have been engaging with them throughout the year. This COP is going to be a different one from COP26.
I think that's extremely important that you mentioned that already it's kind of being mainstreamed into the discussion and exclusive meeting on loss and damage. But there is another way of looking at it. People are talking about that developed countries are also playing a role, that they are also being affected, and they also demand a chunk of loss and damage. Now, we have seen the developed countries, how they played around the key agendas in past. Suddenly, they kind of completely overshadow the kind of important issues by bringing some issues from nowhere and kind of push it through. The net zero is a big example last Glasgow. Who knows what is net zero, when it is to come up, but that's being pushed through. So do you expect that they play some kind of a game around loss and damage to deflect it from the direction it should have been taken?
Well, rich countries have been deliberately delaying, even recognizing the issue of loss and damage.
Right.
And countries who now are facing climate emergency in their own countries are now realizing that it's not, that you can't just mix it up with adaptation. It is a real issue. And I would argue, Jayanta, that that should make them even more empathetic about it. So just to give you an example, last year when Germany had devastating floods, and we saw some horrific pictures of that devastation, but Germany, in a matter of few weeks, was able to mobilize 30 billion euros to help in the recovery and reconstruction process. Which developing country, Jayanta, has resources to do that? So if developed countries are facing, it is still a fraction of their GDP. They should now realize the pain of developing countries and mobilize resources. Because when it comes to mobilizing resources, developed countries have proven that it can be done, be it a financial crisis, be it
Right.
COVID, or be it war in Ukraine.
So before we kind of go over to other issues, very quick to the last question on this round is about the dialogue. The last year in the Glasgow global dialogue was kind of agreed upon, a formal UN global dialogue. What has happened to that dialogue? Where do you stand on that dialogue so far?
So, Janta, as you know, the climate talks were extended in Glasgow,
Right.
and Glasgow dialogue was agreed in that extended period with very little details. It's just that dialogue will happen over the next 3 years. Now, the first dialogue happened in June at Bonn, we all knew that one-off dialogue is not going to be sufficient unless it is backed by submissions and several other meetings. So what has happened in this dialogue is significant in the context of acknowledging the issue. For the first time, European Union, the US, Australia, New Zealand, they all said, yes, there is a gap when it comes to loss and damage finance. We acknowledge that we need to address it, but their solution is different from ours. So the acknowledgement of issue is there. They are now willing to talk about it. So it used to be a
What are
taboo.
their solutions? What are the solutions?
So their solution is insurance, which we know doesn't work for developing countries. Their insurance is continuing with the humanitarian system, which we all know, Jayanta, is based on their own self-interest or geopolitics. It is never sufficient. There's a report by Oxfam which says over the last 5 years, the humanitarian appeals were funded only about 50%. So, and we all know humanitarian appeals don't represent the real cost of losses and damages. So that system is there, which is based on solidarity and cooperation, but it's not working. We have to have an obligation-based system to make sure that people who are affected get adequate support.
In this kind of agenda, the civil society position is very clear, as you spelled out. But what is the position being taken by the developing country, particularly the countries like emerging economies like India, China? This is very important. With the role of India, China, South Africa, the so-called basic countries are very important. So last year we didn't find that they really did push enough. It seemed that they are kind of trading off with the loss and damage with other issues, which where they are in a bit of a back foot. For example, India. So how do you think that developing countries, the countries like India, will respond to the loss and damage issue in COP27?
Well, I have been in touch with the lead negotiator of India on loss and damage, and I am hearing very positive signals that they are going to support the call for loss and damage finance facility. In fact, they made some very substantive interventions during the Glasgow dialogue and saying that we need to be talking about addressing loss and damage and underlining the demand for the facility. So I think India in particular has been absolutely explicit about it. Of course, China has not been as vocal. China was very much part of that formulation that G77 and China put forward at Glasgow COP26. I think now they need to show that unity once again. And they did that. In June, they actually sent a letter to the executive secretary of the UNFCCC to put loss and damage finance on the agenda. So I think they are united. I must also tell you one more development, Jayanta, that AOSIS, Association of Small Island States, have put forward a very concrete proposal on loss and damage fund. They're calling it fund. It doesn't really matter, but it's quite similar to our proposal that we as Climate Action Network and Allies published in May this year. So they are going to have some very concrete conversation around the operational modalities, around principles. So they have developed that piece of work. I really hope that other constituencies, other developing countries get behind that proposal, and they should push collectively as G77 in China. And I must also remind your audience that when we talk about G77 in China, it's the biggest developing country grouping representing 85% of the world's population. So it matters what G77 in China says.
So it seems that a political mobilization is also taking around the civil society demand, and I expect that will give good dividends during the COP27. Let us move to another very key issue, where is also you are kind of part of the global exercise from the front, is the fossil fuel reduction. Now, in this fossil fuel front, we saw for the first time a direct reference to kind of coal cut in Glasgow. So we tweaked with the phrase from phase out to phase down, and likewise, but still some developments were made in Glasgow on that front. How you see it's kind of being taken forward in COP27?
Well, we did take a step forward in recognizing that fossil fuels are the biggest cause of the climate crisis that we are facing right now. And that's why it was important to mention. And I must also underline the fact that Paris Agreement doesn't refer to fossil fuels or coal, oil, and gas. So after a lot of pressure, fossil fuels were mentioned in the Glasgow Climate Pact, but only coal. Why only coal? Why not oil and gas? Because rich countries a majority of them continue to depend on oil and gas. So that's why they pushed back on the inclusion of oil and gas. Now, of course, coal is the biggest culprit when it comes to pollution, but oil and gas are not far behind. So we need to look at the entire range of fossil fuels and not just coal. And in majority of developing countries do depend on coal. So you can sense a clear geopolitics there as well. And we need to, and when you look at their increased investments, Europe's investment, particularly in the wake of Russian war in Ukraine, investments in Africa, it is really concerning because for the short or probably medium term, Africa will get some investments, but in the long term, that's going to result into stranded assets. That's what science is saying. We need to move away from fossil fuels. And now Europe and other rich countries are investing into fossil fuels. That is really, really worrying, which is going to exacerbate the problem.
In fact, Rishi Sunak, the new Prime Minister of UK, in his first address today has referred about this energy crisis and has not really mentioned about the climate change issues in tandem. So it's also been not sending the appropriate signals, as you mentioned. But also a very important point you mentioned about coal and the natural gas and everything taken together. That was the point India was making in Glasgow. But why you are only talking about coal, not the other issues? So do you see any midterm kind of agreement on that, on the coal and other fossil fuels taken together? What is the kind of realistic push forward on that front, you feel, in Egypt?
Well, India must definitely push for the inclusion of all fossil fuels in the agreement at Sharm el-Sheikh. And India should get better in terms of communication, because that was a more communication fiasco at Glasgow than a policy backtracking. Because when you don't have climate finance coming in, Jayanta, and these are all connected issues, the concern of major developing countries on mitigation has been, where is the finance? If finance is not available, then how developing countries can make long-term commitments? And here, rich countries are continuously failing to even provide $100 billion. And whatever they are putting on the table, 70% is loans. And especially when the world is facing a debt crisis. So there are many interconnected issues, and India should communicate those issues very clearly. When rich countries face this energy crisis and they said they need energy security, look at what their response is, right? Almost sidelining climate action and only looking at energy security, which is actually going to cause a massive problem going forward.
I think very important issues, and I feel that again on that front, civil society can take along the developing country bloc and actually push forward the agenda. Now, another very important agenda, which may not be so far as mainstreamed as in case of perhaps a coal agenda or the other agendas, is the migration. This is an issue being affecting the poor countries, the developing countries, and also the emerging economies like India. So what do you feel? Because migration is something which not being reconciled so far in the mainstream climate negotiation in that way. So what's your take on that?
Well, there has been progress on recognizing the issue of migration. At Paris in 2015, one of the agreements that come out of all these conferences alongside Paris Agreement in that year was to establish a task force for displacement. And that task force did come up with recommendations. But the challenge is the same. Do we have sufficient resources to support governments and people so that displacement and forced migration can be addressed adequately? Now, this is also connected with the whole issue of adaptation and loss and damage. If communities are supported and their coping mechanism is boosted, they will not suffer loss and damage. Or if we have done sufficient adaptation in case of, let's say, sea level rise, we will be able to at least reduce the displacement. But that has not happened. So the issue is there on the table. It's not at the very center of climate negotiations right now, but the issue gets discussed under loss and damage. So whatever progress we make on the issue of loss and damage is also going to help people who are being displaced or who are being forced to migrate, such as people in the Sundarbans. And that's where we need to see the progress on loss and damage being a significant issue at this COP so that we can support people who are being forced to migrate.
So basically, development on loss and damage will also contribute to the migration agenda, as you suggest. Now let's go to the adaptation. Adaptation, but I am looking at the Glasgow final report. And under adaptation, it says that notes with serious concern the findings from the contribution of Working Group 1 to the IPCC sixth assessment report, including that climate and weather extremes and their adverse impacts on people and nature will continue to increase with every additional increment of rising temperature. But the rising temperature is happening. And then it requests parties that have not yet done so to submit their adaptation communication to do that. And finally, talked about a comprehensive 2-year Glasgow Sharm el Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation. So where does that start?
So let me put that into perspective. When we talk about mitigation, we can talk about greenhouse gas emissions in terms of gigatons. When we talk about renewable energy, we have metric of gigawatt, but we don't have a similar metric available for adaptation.
Right.
And that's exactly the reason Africa has been pushing for a global goal on adaptation. Where do we want to reach? What is our destination? And how do we reach there? This work program that we just referred to, GLASS work program, is about developing that metrics and being very clear on what we want to achieve when it comes to adaptation. And adaptation is very different from mitigation. It's far more complex. It is connected with all aspects of development. So this work program must pin down on what is needed and with very clear milestones. The challenge is that we should not just look at that as a technical exercise. Some amount of technical work is needed, but politically, we have to make a commitment that we don't want people to suffer. Now, when you talk about the issue of displacement, if we don't put sufficient adaptation in place, that's why people are forced to migrate.
Exactly.
So,
Absolutely.
So we have to make sure that the issue of adaptation is prioritized at the local level, at the national level, but that has to be supported through global resources. And this is where rich countries are failing again. Very little money is going for adaptation because rich countries don't see this as a money-making business, right? And
so Global Adaptation Fund
are largely left on their own.
So Global Adaptation Fund is not really that robust as it. But this 2 years work program is almost has passed 50% of its time because from Glasgow to Sharm el Sheikh we reached. So has there been any push forward, significant push forward so far?
So there have been some very useful workshops where some of these issues on how to measure adaptation, what are the elements that we need to be looking at, and also the discussion on resources. But as I said, my fear is that it can all boil down to something as a technical exercise, which we should not allow to happen. Technical work should result into a political guidance and a commitment to prioritize adaptation.
Right.
We have reached a point, Jayanta, where mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage all are equally important. Equally important. At 1.2 degree of temperature rise scenarios, look at the disasters around us. Even at 1.5, imagine the world we'll be living in. So we need to stay below 1.5. If we do not adapt, we'll see more loss and damage. So all three have become important. That recognition has to come from this very COP in Sharm el Sheikh.
I think very important point you mentioned about kind of understanding the linkages of all this. They are not standalone phenomena. When you are talking about loss and damage, displacement, mitigation, adaptation, they are linked and being contributing each other either in positive way or negative way. So I think that's a very important part. I don't know how far it will be taken forward in Sharm el Sheikh to recognize and reconcile the combined and cumulative kind of issues, as you said. Finally, Harjeet, is that the South Asian countries. The South Asian countries like India, Bangladesh, and all Maldives and Sri Lanka, Pakistan, they are all being suffering due to this climatic impacts, and perhaps are more kind of impacted by this loss and damage than anyone else in the world. But unfortunately, the geopolitics doesn't allow them to talk in one voice. So Do you expect any change of that strategy? These countries to come more close on the climate issues, have more stronger voice together get more out of the developed countries in Sharm el Sheikh?
I do see some headway, but not as a collective, but more because of individual circumstances. Pakistan being the chair of G77 in China and suffering devastating floods with one third of the country underwater, they have now prioritized the issue of loss and damage, which was not the case earlier, right? And uh, for other countries, and even India making a strong voice on the issue of loss and damage, which has been so important for countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal, and which also points towards the importance of adaptation as part of climate action. So I think individually countries have made some right signals. They should all come together and coordinate. This is something that we have been missing. As South Asia, we are not together. While we share rivers, oceans, mountains, and even the weather systems,
And we share also
even
the air pollution.
cyclones.
We share the air pollution, we share the
Exactly,
climate
we share
change,
air
but
pollution as
not.
well. So we need to come together as a political bloc and understand that ecology binds us, right? Even economies bind us. So how can we coordinate better and fight for our own interest as well in the UFC space as other countries do, such as Africa, such as Latin American countries. So there are geographical groupings which do
Exactly.
negotiate together.
Absolutely. I think we see the Africa group, we see the kind of other geographical group, but not in Asia so far because of the geopolitical differences Harjeet is talking about. Many thanks, Harjeet. It's a wonderful, wonderful, as usual, discussing with you. You have mentioned about the major agendas to come up. I'm sure that some surprises are there. Always the developed countries are spring some surprises or other, and kind of try to completely deflect the major discussion. I hope the civil society voices like you can try to stem that as far as possible. I also hope that the India, Pakistan, and other countries in South Asia can go beyond their geopolitical positioning and can start working together to reach the common goal of climate security in this region. And exactly, and overall, the world is not in a good shape. So Sharm el Sheikh, a developing country COP, should lead to a safer tomorrow. So thank you, Harjeet. See you at Sharm el Sheikh soon.
Thank you
So
so
we'll
much.
talk
Yeah,
in
looking
person.
forward to
We'll
see
talk
you.
in person. Great to have you there, and thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure, Jen.